The cold glass of the restaurant window did little to numb the fire coiling in Arthur's gut. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, tracing silver lines down the pane, blurring the scene within. But Arthur saw it with perfect, painful clarity. Ilara, his wife, was laughing. It was a laugh he hadn't heard directed at him in years, a genuine, unrestrained peal of delight that tilted her head back and made the diamonds at her ears sparkle under the soft, ambient light. The recipient of that laugh was Julian Vance, a man she had dismissed with a wave of her hand and a casual, cutting phrase. "He's just a friend, Arthur. Don't be so insecure." They thought he was insecure. They thought he was a failure, a small-time architect with quaint little dreams that were an embarrassment at the lavish family dinners hosted by her father. They looked at his quiet demeanor, his preference for books over boasts, his simple, well-made suits instead of ostentatious brands, and saw weakness. They didn't know that the foundation of their entire world, the very ground they stood on with such unshakable confidence, was about to give way. Within the hour, their laughter would curdle into ash, their confidence would shatter like this very glass, and everything they believed to be true about him, and themselves, would be undone. They were celebrating a victory built on his perceived irrelevance. What they didn't know was that he owned the building they were in, and that was only the beginning. It's a strange thing, isn't it, to watch your own life from the outside, like a play you've already read the ending to. I wonder if you've ever felt that way, standing on the precipice of a moment that you know will change everything. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoy seeing arrogance meet its match, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and deserved justice. Now let's go back to how it all began, to the first crack in a carefully constructed facade. It had started 3 months earlier with a name that began to appear on Ilara's phone with increasing frequency: Julian. At first it was innocuous, a text here, a brief call there. When Arthur had asked, perched on the edge of their marital bed while she applied her night cream with meticulous strokes, her answer was swift and dismissive. "He's a consultant for Dad's firm," she'd said, not meeting his eyes in the mirror. "We're working on a new investment portfolio. It's dreadfully boring." The explanation was plausible. Her father, Richard Sterling, a man who measured the world in quarterly earnings and stock prices, often roped his family into his business dealings. But there was something in her tone, a brittle edge that signaled a closed door. Arthur, a man who built his life on understanding structures, recognized a load-bearing wall when he saw one. He didn't push. Patience, he had learned long ago, was a form of strength, not weakness. The family dinners were the primary stage for his humiliation. Held every Sunday in the Sterling's palatial home, a monument to new money designed to look like old, these gatherings were a ritual of quiet condescension. Richard held court at the head of a massive mahogany table, his voice booming as he recounted his week's triumphs. His wife, Beatrice, sat silently beside him, a portrait of elegant complicity, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes. It was at one of these dinners that Julian first made a physical appearance. He was exactly as Arthur had pictured, handsome in a slick, predictable way, with a watch that cost more than Arthur's first car, and a smile that was all teeth. "Arthur," Richard had bellowed, clapping Julian on the shoulder. "This is the man I was telling you about, Julian, the one who's going to help us finally break into the Asian markets. A real shark." He turned to Arthur, a dismissive glint in his eye. "Arthur here is an architect. He designs buildings." The way he said the word buildings made it sound like a child's hobby, like assembling models from a kit. "Anything interesting on the drawing board, son? Another quaint little library for some suburban town?" The table chuckled politely. Ilara shifted in her seat, a faint blush on her cheeks, but she said nothing. She never did. Her silence was a blade, and it cut him more deeply than her father's overt scorn. Arthur offered a small, calm smile. "Just a community project in the North End. he replied, his voice even. Trying to revitalize the old warehouse district. He felt the familiar weight in his pocket, the cool, dense metal of a single, intricately cut key. It was his anchor in these moments, a private reminder of a reality they couldn't begin to comprehend. Richard snorted. Revitalization, a noble and utterly profitless pursuit. Julian, you see, understands that the only thing worth building is capital. Julian smirked, raising his glass in a mock toast to Arthur. To each his own, I suppose. Some of us build legacies, others, community centers. The laughter was louder this time. Elara joined in, a light tinkling sound that felt like stones rattling in Arthur's chest. He looked at her, his wife, laughing at a joke made at his expense by a man she claimed was just a friend. He didn't react. He simply took a slow sip of his water, the key in his pocket feeling heavier than ever. It was the key to his new office, a penthouse suite in the city's tallest, most prestigious skyscraper. The very skyscraper Richard Sterling had been trying and failing to get a meeting with the owners of for the past 6 months. Arthur was the owner, and this dinner, this theater of casual cruelty, was solidifying a resolve that had been slowly hardening within him for years. The humiliation at the Sunday dinners became a recurring theme, a script they all followed with grim predictability. The following week, Richard spent a full 10 minutes lamenting the state of modern architecture, directing his diatribe at Arthur as if he were the sole representative of the profession's failings. "There's no ambition anymore," he declared, gesturing with a fork. "Everything is glass and steel, cold and impersonal, no soul. It's all about small, safe projects. No one takes risks." He looked pointedly at Arthur. "You have to be willing to risk it all to build something that lasts, son. That's a lesson you learn in the real world, not hunched over a drafting table." Arthur listened, his expression placid. He thought of the project he had just secured, a multi-billion-dollar contract to design and oversee the construction of a new international arts museum. A project so audacious and visionary, it was already being hailed as a future landmark. He had won the bid under the name of his private firm, Ethelred Designs, a name that meant nothing to them, a shield he had carefully constructed over the last decade. He had built his fortune quietly, meticulously, investing the substantial inheritance his grandfather, a man of quiet industry and genuine integrity, had left him. He had never told Elara or her family the true extent of his wealth. He had wanted to be valued for who he was, not what he had. It was a foolish, romantic notion, and he was now paying the price for it. "Risk is a matter of perspective, Richard," Arthur said calmly, cutting his steak with precision. "Sometimes the greatest risk is not in a single grand gesture, but in the slow erosion of one's foundation." His words hung in the air, too abstract for Richard to grasp, but sharp enough to make Beatrice shift uncomfortably. Elara, however, wasn't listening. She was engrossed in her phone, a small, secret smile playing on her lips as she typed. Arthur knew, with a certainty that was cold and hard as stone, that she was texting Julian. Later that evening, as they drove home in a tense silence, he had asked her about it. "You seem distracted tonight." "Just work," she'd lied, her voice flat. "Julian was sending over some market projections for Dad. It's all very high stakes." The ease with which the lie came was what unsettled him most. It was practiced, smooth, a well-worn path. In the privacy of his study that night, surrounded by the books and blueprints that were his true companions, Arthur made a decision. He would no longer be a passive observer in the slow demolition of his own life. He had built empires on paper, structures of soaring beauty and unshakable strength. It was time to apply those skills to his reality. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. "David," he said, his voice low but firm, "it's time. I want a full, discreet audit of all my assets, particularly the ones held jointly. And I need you to draw up the paperwork for a corporate restructuring, effective immediately." The game had changed. They just didn't know they were playing. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in deception. A quiet war fought on two fronts. Outwardly, Arthur maintained his role as the placid, slightly disappointing husband. He attended the Sunday dinners, absorbed the insults, and offered his usual, measured, thoughtful responses that were invariably misinterpreted as weakness. He watched as Julian became a fixture in their lives, no longer just a name on a phone, but a presence in their home. He would arrive under the pretense of discussing business with Alara, spreading financial reports across their dining room table, his cologne lingering in the air long after he'd gone. He had a way of touching her, a hand on her arm to emphasize a point, a light brush against her back as she passed, that was both casual and proprietary. Ilara, for her part, seemed to bloom under the attention. She was more animated, her laughter more frequent, a stark contrast to the weary indifference she usually showed Arthur. One afternoon, Arthur came home early from a site visit, the satisfying scent of concrete dust and fresh lumber still clinging to his clothes. He walked into the kitchen to find Alara and Julian huddled together over a laptop, their heads nearly touching. They sprang apart when they saw him, a flicker of guilt in Alara's eyes that was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Arthur," she said, her voice a little too bright, "you're home early. Julian was just showing me the final proposal for the Singapore venture. It's brilliant." Julian stood, extending a hand to Arthur, his smile as polished as ever. "Just tying up the loose ends," he said smoothly. "Your father-in-law is a titan, Arthur. It's a privilege to be a part of his vision." "I'm sure it is," Arthur replied, his gaze steady. He didn't take the offered hand. On the laptop screen, he caught a glimpse of a familiar logo, the stylized A of his own holding company, Aethelred Capital, the parent corporation for all his ventures. It was the company that held the deed to the downtown skyscraper, the museum project, and dozens of other assets Richard Sterling would have killed for. They were looking at his own financial empire, and they had no idea. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just an affair. It was something more calculated, colder. They were planning something, and it involved him, or rather, what they mistakenly believed to be his limited, jointly held assets. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of them together, poring over the symbol of his life's secret work, was burned into his mind. He lay beside Alara, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, and felt a profound, aching loneliness. He was married to a stranger. After she was sound asleep, he slipped out of bed and went to his study. He activated a sound-dampening device he'd had installed for late-night calls with international partners and dialed a number. The man who answered was a private investigator, the best in the city, known for his discretion and thoroughness. "Mr. Vance," Arthur said, his voice a low whisper, "I have a job for you. I need a complete workup on a man named Julian Vance. Financials, connections, everything. And I need surveillance on my wife, Ilara Sterling Hayes." He paused, the words tasting like poison. "I need to know exactly what they're building." The investigation was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Within a week, Arthur had a preliminary report. It confirmed the affair with photographs that left no room for doubt. But it was the financial intelligence that was the true bombshell. Julian was not the financial prodigy he claimed to be. He was a grifter, deep in debt, with a history of failed ventures and lawsuits. The Singapore venture was a shell company designed to siphon funds. And Richard Sterling, blinded by his own arrogance in Julian's flattery, was walking right into the trap. Worse, they were planning to use the upcoming divorce settlement from Arthur, which they assumed would include half of his modest architectural firm and their shared home, as the seed capital for their fraudulent enterprise. They had already had lawyers draft preliminary documents which grossly overvalued his visible assets while remaining blissfully ignorant of his true worth. They were going to cheat him, humiliate him, and use his own money to do it. The final piece of the puzzle arrived via a discreet email from his investigator. It was a dinner reservation for two at Le Veyron, one of an exclusive, members-only restaurant that occupied the top floor of the city's most iconic building, his building. The reservation was for the following night. The note attached was simple. They are celebrating. Arthur stared at the email, a cold calm descending over him. He knew what he had to do. He would not confront them with rage and accusations. That was their language, not his. He would use the tools he knew best: structure, precision, and the devastating, unshakable power of the truth. He would let them walk into a room they believed they controlled, a future they thought they had secured, and he would show them that they had built their castle on a foundation of sand. The next evening he would follow her, and he would bring their world crashing down. The evening air was cool and crisp, a welcome contrast to the simmering heat in Arthur's chest. He sat in his car, a discreet dark sedan parked across the street from their home, and watched the house he had helped design. He had poured his heart into its lines, creating spaces filled with light and warmth, hoping to build a home, not just a house. Now, it felt like a museum of a life that was never truly his. He watched as Alara emerged, a vision in a sapphire blue dress that shimmered under the porch light. She checked her reflection in the darkened window of the front door, a small, excited smile on her face. It was the same smile he'd seen when she was texting Julian, a smile for another man, in a home he had built for her. She slipped into her own car, a sleek convertible her father had bought her, and pulled out of the driveway without a backward glance. Arthur waited a moment, letting the distance between them grow before starting his own engine. The pursuit was strangely anticlimactic. There were no high-speed turns, no desperate maneuvers. He simply followed her taillights as they cut a familiar path through the city's arteries. He drove with a calm, detached precision, as if he were merely an observer, a narrator in his own story. He knew the route she was taking. It led downtown, to the financial district, to the glittering spire of glass and steel that dominated the skyline. His building, the quiet hum of his car's engine, was the only sound, a steady counterpoint to the storm of thoughts within him. He thought of his grandfather, a stonemason who had taught him that a man's worth was measured not by the noise he made, but by the things he built to last. He had spent his life trying to honor that lesson, building his career and his fortune in silence, believing that integrity was its own reward. He had been wrong, or perhaps only partially right. Integrity was essential, but it had to be paired with the courage to defend it. As he drove, his hand went to his breast pocket. He wasn't carrying a key tonight. Instead, his fingers brushed against a slim, leather-bound portfolio. It contained a few simple documents: the deed to the building they were driving towards, a summary of Aethelred Capital's assets, and the final, damning report from his private investigator. It was a testament, a reckoning, a foundation of facts upon which he would deconstruct their world of lies. Ilara's car turned into the private entrance of the Sterling Tower. Arthur didn't follow. He continued for another block before turning into a different, even more discreet entrance, the owner's private garage. The security guard, a man named Michael, whom Arthur always made a point to greet by name, nodded respectfully. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes. The top floor is prepped as you requested." "Thank you, Michael," Arthur said, his voice steady. He took the private elevator, a silent, swift ascent that mirrored his own hidden rise in the world. As the city lights spread out beneath him like a carpet of scattered jewels, he felt no anger, no thirst for revenge, only a profound, weary sadness and a steely resolve. He was not here to destroy them. He was here to reveal the truth. The consequences of that truth were theirs, and theirs alone, to bear. He stepped out of the elevator, not onto the restaurant floor, but into his private observation lounge, a stark, minimalist space with a single wall of floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a god's-eye view of the city, and, through a discreetly angled view, a clear line of sight into the main dining room of Le Veyron. He stood in the shadows, a ghost at their feast, and watched. There they were, at the best table in the house, a corner booth with a panoramic view. Ilara, Julian, and to his surprise, her father, Richard. The three of them were laughing, their faces flushed with wine and triumph. A bottle of champagne, the most expensive on the menu, sat chilling in a silver bucket beside them. Richard raised his glass, his voice, even from this distance, carrying the familiar tone of self-congratulation. Arthur didn't need to hear the words. He knew what they were toasting. They were toasting the success of their Singapore venture. They were toasting the imminent and lucrative divorce. They were toasting the downfall of the quiet, unassuming man they had so fatally underestimated. They were toasting him. Arthur watched for a long moment, letting the scene burn itself into his memory. He observed the easy intimacy between Ilara and Julian, the smug satisfaction on his father-in-law's face. He saw the culmination of 1,000 small betrayals, 1,000 casual cruelties, all gathered here at this glittering peak, this precipice. Then, with a deep, cleansing breath, he turned from the window and walked towards the door that connected his private lounge to the restaurant. The quiet before the storm was over. It was time for the rain to fall. He entered the restaurant not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet purpose of a man who belonged there. The maitre d', a man named Jean-Paul who was known for his intimidating formality, saw him and his expression immediately softened into one of genuine deference. "Mr. Hayes," he said, bowing his head slightly, "an unexpected pleasure. Your table, of course?" Arthur gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Thank you, Jean-Paul, but I won't be staying. I'm just here to join my family." He gestured towards the corner booth. Jean-Paul's eyes widened for a fraction of a second as he made the connection. A flicker of understanding and perhaps pity before his professional mask slipped back into place. "Of course, sir, right this way." He followed the maitre d' across the plush carpet, the low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware seeming to fade into a dull roar in his ears. Every step was deliberate, measured. He felt the eyes of other diners on him, drawn by the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. They saw a man in a simple dark suit walking towards the most boisterous table in the restaurant, and they sensed a story about to unfold. The first to see him was Richard. His booming laugh died in his throat, replaced by a look of utter astonishment, which quickly morphed into irritation. "Arthur, what in God's name are you doing here? This is a private celebration." Ilara turned, and her face went pale. The brilliant smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure shock, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. Julian, ever the performer, was the first to recover, forcing a tight, unnatural smile. "Arthur, old man, fancy seeing you here. We were just, finalizing some details for a new project." "So I see," Arthur said, his voice calm and even. He remained standing, looking down at the three of them. The power dynamic of 1,000 Sunday dinners was instantly, jarringly, inverted. A project so important it required champagne and the best table in the city. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the table, lingering for a moment on the way Ilara instinctively shifted closer to Julian. "I wasn't aware my presence was required for the final details." Richard puffed out his chest, his face reddening with anger. "Now see here," he began, his voice rising. "This is a private business matter. You can't just barge in here. It's inappropriate." "Is it?" Arthur's voice was soft, yet it cut through the tension like a scalpel. "I find myself wondering what's more inappropriate, Richard. My joining you for dinner, or my wife and her business associate conspiring with my father-in-law to defraud me?" The word defraud landed on the table like a block of ice. Ilara gasped. "Arthur, how dare you? We were doing nothing of the sort." "Weren't you?" Arthur's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw not the quiet, accommodating man she had married, but a stranger, a man of unshakable, resolute calm. "You're celebrating the Singapore venture, are you not? a venture to be funded in part by the generous divorce settlement you plan to extract from me." He let the words hang in the air. Julian began to bluster. "This is outrageous. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're just a bitter, jealous husband making wild accusations." Arthur didn't even look at him. His focus was entirely on Alara and Richard. "Am I? I know the Singapore venture is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I know that you, Julian, are over $3 million in debt to some very unpleasant people. And I know that you, Richard, have leveraged nearly a quarter of your company's assets on the promise of this fraudulent deal." The color drained from Richard's face. How could you possibly know that?" Arthur finally turned his gaze to Julian, a look of mild pity in his eyes. "You see, when you build your life on lies, you forget that some people still value the truth. And the truth, gentlemen, is a structure with a very solid foundation." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the leather portfolio. He didn't open it, he simply placed it on the table. The symbolic object was no longer a key, but a dossier, a quiet bomb. "This is my copy of the truth," he said softly, "and I'm afraid it's going to be a very unpleasant read for all of you." The portfolio lay on the pristine white tablecloth, a dark rectangle of judgment amidst the crystal and silver. For a long moment, nobody moved. The confident, celebratory atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. It was Richard who finally broke, his arrogance warring with a creeping dread. He snatched the portfolio and fumbled it open. His eyes scanned the first page, a summary of Julian's catastrophic financial history, and a low groan escaped his lips. He flipped to the next, a detailed schematic of the shell company, then to the next, a transcript of an incriminating phone call. His face, already ruddy, turned a ghastly shade of gray. He looked up, not at Arthur, but at Julian, his eyes filled with a dawning, murderous rage. You lied to me." Julian, for his part, was staring at Arthur, his composure finally cracking. The slick smile was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate panic. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question aimed at Arthur. It was the question they should have asked years ago. Arthur ignored him, his attention fixed on his wife. Alara was looking at the documents upside down, her expression a mixture of confusion and terror. "Arthur, what is this? I don't understand." "Don't you, Alara?" His voice was not accusatory, but filled with a deep, profound disappointment. "You understand that you have been having an affair with this man for months. You understand that you planned to leave me. And you understand that you intended to take as much as you possibly could in the divorce. Money you felt you were entitled to. Money you believed I didn't deserve." He let his words sink in. "The only thing you didn't understand," he continued, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, "is that you were betting on the wrong horse." He gestured around the opulent restaurant. "You love this place, don't you? The exclusivity, the power it represents. You've mentioned for years how much you wished you could be members." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Your father has been trying to get a permanent reservation here for the better part of a year. Isn't that right, Richard? Calling in favors, trying to find out who the owner is." Richard looked up from the papers, his face a mask of disbelief. Arthur gave a small, sad smile. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Arthur Hayes, and I am the sole owner of Aethelred Capital, the corporation that owns this building, and the one across the street, and the Arts Museum currently under construction by the waterfront." This was the quiet bomb, the simple, devastating statement that reordered their universe. Ilara's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping. Richard looked as if he'd been physically struck, his jaw slack, the damning papers slipping from his fingers. Julian just stared, his mind visibly struggling to process the impossible truth. "No," Richard stammered, That's not possible. You're just an architect. You make blueprints." "I do make blueprints," Arthur agreed, his voice gentle. I design things. And while you were all busy measuring my worth by the car I drove or the label on my suit, I was designing a life. I was building a fortune you knew nothing about, because I wanted my wife to love me for the man I was, not the numbers in my bank account. He looked directly at Alara, and the disappointment in his eyes was a physical force. It appears I was a fool. He reached down and picked up the portfolio from the table. Everything you need to know is in here. The full extent of my assets, the full extent of their deception, and the consequences. He straightened up, his posture immaculate, a man in complete control. The reservation for the Singapore venture is canceled, permanently, as is your credit line, Richard, which I believe was secured by my Ethelred-backed bonds you didn't know you were using. As for you, Julian, I believe your other creditors will be very interested to know where you are. He turned to leave. Ilara finally found her voice, a desperate, pleading cry. Arthur, wait! He stopped, but he did not turn around. Please, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Don't do this. Arthur stood for a moment with his back to them, a solitary figure against the glittering backdrop of the city he owned. It's already done, Ilara, he said, without a trace of malice. You all built this. I just turned on the lights. And with that, he walked away, leaving them in the ruins of their own making, the uneaten meal and the celebratory champagne mocking them from the table. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic symphony of desperation. As Arthur walked away, he could hear Richard's voice, no longer booming with authority but thin and reedy with panic, hissing at Julian. He heard Ilara's sobs, the sound of a woman whose entire reality had just been pulverized. He didn't look back. He took his private elevator down to the garage, the silence of the descent a welcome relief. He had won, but it felt less like a victory and more like the end of a long, painful illness. The fever had broken, leaving him weary but clear-headed for the first time in years. His phone began to ring almost immediately. The first call was from Ilara. He let it go to voicemail. The second was from Richard. He ignored that one too. The third was a text from Beatrice, Ilara's mother, a woman who had been a silent accomplice to years of his humiliation. The message was a single, pleading question. What is happening? He was halfway home when a call came from a number he didn't recognize, but he answered it. Arthur, it's Charles Sterling. Charles was Richard's brother, a minority partner in the firm, and a man Arthur had always found to be decent, if overshadowed by his bombastic sibling. His voice was strained. I just got off the phone with the bank. Our primary credit line has been frozen. They mentioned Ethelred Capital. Arthur, what the hell is going on? Richard isn't answering his phone. Richard is currently indisposed, Arthur said calmly, steering the car through the quiet suburban streets. I suggest you have your corporate counsel look into a recent venture proposal concerning the Singapore market. You'll find it's a house of cards, Charles. I just removed the foundation. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Ethelred, my God, that's you? It is, Arthur confirmed. I'm sorry you've been caught in this, Charles. Your brother's ambition has become a liability. I knew it, Charles breathed, a note of awe in his voice. I always told him he was underestimating you. A small, bitter smile touched Arthur's lips. It seems to be a family trait. Just as he was pulling into his own driveway, another car pulled up behind him. A distinguished-looking older gentleman stepped out. It was Mr. Davies, Richard's most important client, a man who controlled a pension fund worth billions. Mr. Hayes, he said, his expression grim, I was on my way to see Richard. I got a call from my risk assessment team about Ethelred Capital. They told me to speak to you. Arthur had known this moment would come. Mr. Davies was his unexpected ally, though he didn't know it yet. Arthur had anonymously tipped off the man's risk assessors about Julian's fraud weeks ago, knowing that Davies's due diligence was impeccable. Mr. Davies, Arthur said, nodding a greeting, I believe we have a great deal to discuss. "Perhaps you should come inside. I was just about to make some coffee." The two men walked into the house together, leaving the chaos of the city behind. The real consequences were just beginning to unfold, not in a dramatic restaurant confrontation, but in quiet, decisive conversations that would dismantle Richard Sterling's empire, piece by piece. Inside, Arthur laid out the truth for Mr. Davies, providing documents and evidence that painted a clear, undeniable picture of Richard's recklessness and Julian's fraud. Davies, a man whose career was built on prudence and integrity, listened in stony silence, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When Arthur was finished, the older man shook his head slowly. "I've known Richard for 20 years, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I knew he was arrogant, but I never thought he was a fool." He stood up and extended a hand to Arthur. "Mr. Hayes, you have not only saved my fund from a catastrophic investment, you have shown remarkable forbearance. The Sterling Group will no longer be managing our portfolio. I'll be moving our assets, effective immediately." It was a death sentence for Richard's company. Davies' fund was his cornerstone client. Losing it would trigger a crisis of confidence that would gut the firm. As Mr. Davies was leaving, another car screeched to a halt in the driveway. This time it was Alara, her face streaked with tears, her sapphire dress now looking rumpled and out of place. She ran towards the house just as Beatrice's car pulled in behind hers. Her mother got out, her face a mask of anxiety. Alara burst through the front door. "Arthur, you have to stop this," she cried, her voice ragged. "Dad's on the phone with the bank. They're calling in his loans. You're destroying him. You're destroying us." Beatrice hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands, a spectator to the end of her world. "He destroyed himself, Alara," Arthur said, his voice devoid of anger. "He made his choices. You made yours." "It was a mistake," she pleaded, reaching for his arm. He stepped back, avoiding her touch. "It wasn't a mistake, Alara. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. This was a series of deliberate choices. You chose to lie to me. You chose to have an affair. You chose to stand by silently while your father belittled me week after week. You chose to plot my financial ruin with your lover. These are not mistakes. They are character." Beatrice finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Arthur, please, think of the family." Arthur turned his gaze to his mother-in-law, the silent enabler. "I have thought of this family, Beatrice. For 10 years I have sat at your table and endured your husband's scorn and your silent judgment. I have been treated as a failure, an accessory, an afterthought. Where was your concern for the family then? When your daughter was betraying her marriage vows? When your husband was about to be swindled by a con artist? Your definition of family seems to be one where everyone enables Richard's ego and protects your comfortable lifestyle at all costs." Beatrice flinched as if struck, and for the first time a flicker of genuine shame appeared in her eyes. She had no answer. There was none to give. The truth, once revealed, was irrefutable. The moral mirror he held up to them showed a reflection they could not bear to see. A month later, the dust had begun to settle, revealing a starkly altered landscape. Sterling and Associates, once a formidable player in the city's financial scene, was in ruins. Stripped of its largest client and crippled by the called-in loans, it was forced into bankruptcy. Richard Sterling, a man who had built his identity on the foundations of wealth and power, was a broken man, facing not only financial ruin, but potential legal action from other investors Julian had swindled. Julian himself had vanished, likely having fled the country the moment he realized the game was up, leaving a trail of debt and destruction in his wake. Arthur, meanwhile, was finally living his life out in the open. The story of his silent rise and the dramatic fall of the Sterling Empire had become the stuff of legend in business circles. Ethelred Capital, no longer a shadowy entity, was now recognized as a major force of innovation and integrity. He had moved out of the house he had shared with Alara and into a penthouse apartment in his flagship building, a space of clean lines, natural light, and breathtaking views. It was a home he had designed for himself, a sanctuary of peace and order. He stood now at the vast window, looking down at the city he was helping to shape. The museum was taking form on the waterfront, its audacious curves already promising to be the landmark he had envisioned. He felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not in the ruin of others, but in the affirmation of his own values. He had weathered the storm, and he had done so without sacrificing his integrity, without becoming like them. He received a letter from Alara. It wasn't pleading or demanding, but quiet and reflective. She was living with her mother in a small, rented apartment. Her father, she wrote, refused to see her, blaming her for introducing Julian into their lives. She had taken a job as an assistant at an art gallery, a job she'd gotten on her own merit. She apologized, not for the affair, not for the money, but for her blindness. "I never saw you," she wrote. "I looked at you, but I never saw the man who was there all along. I was so busy chasing a life I thought I was supposed to want, I never stopped to appreciate the life I had." It was the first honest thing he had heard from her in years. He agreed to meet her for coffee. She looked different. The expensive clothes and jewelry were gone, replaced by a simple dress. Her face was thinner, and there were lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but she met his gaze directly. There was no artifice left. "I'm not here to ask for another chance," she said, her voice steady. "I know I don't deserve one. I just wanted to thank you." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Thank me?" "For turning on the lights," she said, echoing his final words to her at the restaurant. "I've spent my whole life in a gilded cage, Arthur. I was so afraid of the world outside of my father's influence that I clung to it, even when I was miserable. You didn't just destroy his world, you destroyed my cage. And for the first time, I feel free. It's terrifying, but it's real." He listened, and he saw a flicker of the woman he had once fallen in love with. A woman who had been buried under years of her family's toxic ambition. There would be no reconciliation. The trust that formed the bedrock of a marriage had been systematically demolished. But as he looked at her, he felt not anger, but a sense of closure. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my life, I truly don't know. I think I'm going to try to build something of my own, something small and real." Arthur nodded slowly. "That sounds like a good blueprint," he said. And for the first time in a very long time, they shared a smile that was not born of secrets or social obligation, but of a simple, shared, and painful humanity. As Arthur walked back to his office, the city air felt fresh and clean. The weight he had carried for years was finally gone. He had learned a hard lesson, that true worth is not about the noise you make or the status you project, but about the integrity of your foundations. Arrogance builds on sand, and eventually the tide always comes in. Patience, integrity, and quiet strength, these were the materials that endured. He had been underestimated, and in their blindness his antagonists had handed him the power to redefine his own life. He hadn't sought revenge. He had simply demanded the truth, and the truth had done the rest. The resolution wasn't about their downfall, but about his own liberation. He was free to be the man he had been all along, no longer hiding his light for fear that others would find it blinding. It's a powerful thing to realize that the respect you crave from others is nothing compared to the respect you must have for yourself. Sometimes the most important structures we can ever build are the boundaries that protect our own integrity. What do you think? Have you ever had a moment where you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for your own truth? I'd love to read your stories and thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this story of vindication satisfying, please give it a like and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption. Until next time, remember to build your life on a foundation of truth, because it's the only thing that can never be torn down.